I wanted to talk to you about the history of this technique as far as the guitar is concerned. So as we've established earlier on, this technique has been in use on other plectrum-based instruments for thousands of years. But it was adopted on the guitar early on as well, when people started using plectrum-based guitar. And to talk about this, we have to know a little bit about the history of plectrum-based guitar. The idea of playing the guitar with a plectrum is fairly new, about 100 years old. And it didn't get popular until the 1920s. So we're not even 100 years into the popularity contest yet. And this has to do with the evolution of guitar construction. The first steel string guitar, and when they started to improve the bracing of the instruments around the 1920s. I'm not an expert in guitar history, so you could probably research this on your own, but I think I'm kind of right. And even before the 1920s, most guitar players, they opted to use the banjo, whether the 4-string banjo or the 6-string banjo. And that's what Django Reinhardt played. He played the 6-string banjo before switching to the guitar much later, sometime in the 20s. Another guitar player who was playing mainly banjo before switching to the guitar was Eddie Lang. And one of the early adopters of the acoustic guitar, plectrum based anyway, was the blues guitar player Lonnie Johnson. Check him out. And just to give you a little bit of context, Lonnie Johnson was born in 1899, Eddie Lang in 1907 or 1908, and Django Reinhardt in 1910, January 23rd, 1910. Don't forget. And another very important guitar player is Nick Lucas, who was born in 1897. And he played the guitar early on, but like many others, he preferred the banjo just because it projected more. Until the guitar was really perfected in the 1920s, that's when he really switched to the guitar for good. And if you've seen the movie Insidious, you can hear Nick Lucas is playing in there. Really good movie. So all these guitar players used this old style technique, pretty much in its pure form, the way I described it. And anyone born before 1920 tended to use this technique. For copyright reasons, I can't share footage of these players, but you can find them on YouTube, and I've spelled out the names of the guitar players for you somewhere on the screen. I especially encourage you to check out videos of Nick Lucas and Lonnie Johnson, because there are quite a few videos of them, and they're using this old traditional technique the way I described them to you. So Lonnie Johnson was a blues player, I'm not. But yeah, it's this old technique that I described. Ultimately, what I mean to say is that all these guitar players used this technique. This was the standard guitar technique. There were no real other techniques. No one had really thought of doing this or anything else. It was just like that, because that's how it's been played. Plectrum-based instruments have been played for thousands of years. Another player who apparently played this way, based on descriptions, was Charlie Christian. And by the way, this is a Charlie Christian style guitar made by my buddy Martin Tremblay here in Montreal, Quebec. Vive le Québec! So then what happened? The amplification improved, technology improved, we have microphones, we have electric guitars, and the problem with that is that when you use this floating hand technique, the resonance of the instrument makes it so that it might be prone to feedback. Luckily, here I put my amp setting low enough that doesn't happen. But imagine being in a jazz club with an archtop guitar and the amp turned up pretty loud. It might be prone to feedback. So for the first time, players had to find a way to make things work if they encountered such an issue. So that's when players started to experiment with touching the strings so as to mute some of these unwanted noise. Also, if you watch videos of guitar players in the 1930s, mainly country players, early forefathers of bluegrass, flat pickers, you can see that they started to flatten out the wrist a little bit. And some of them are still using the rest stroke, downstroke technique, but some of them are starting to explore alternate picking. So gradually, the technique started to branch out. There were still players who used the old technique, at least some hybrid form, and others who are gravitating towards this, what is considered today the standard, technique like this, alternate picking or sweep picking, but the idea to rest the hand against the bridge. And as we've established, this allows you to play very, very intricate lines that just wouldn't be easy if you use the old technique. And then, rock and roll was invented. You have the solid body guitar. There's really no need anymore to take advantage of the resonance of the instrument. Distortion was invented, and you definitely do not want your guitar to resonate, or else it's going to sound like crap. Slowly but surely, the old technique was forgotten. So I hope that this video at least doesn't revive the technique, because you don't necessarily have to use it, but at least people can be aware that this technique exists. It's funny because I play with this old technique, and people sometimes they see me play like, wow, what is this strange new technique you're using? But thousands of years old. So the reason why I have this archtop guitar with me is to talk about this hybrid technique that some players developed. I'll be the first to admit that I'm not an electric guitar player, and that I'm not super good at this either. My specialty is really the old pure form, but I can still talk a little bit about it. So let me just recap. This hybrid technique involves flattening out your wrist a little bit to varying degrees, just so that the plane of attack is more parallel, allowing you to do alternate picking and sweep picking in both directions with much greater ease than when you adopt this old form, which favors downstrokes. And some of these players would include George Benson, Joe Pass, Frank Vignola, kind of a modern player, Jimmy Bruno, Howard Alden, and quite a few others. I think Johnny Smith as well. So I'm not saying that they all have the same technique, but they change the angle. They're still floating somewhat, but they each have their own way of doing things. And this allows you to use this kind of thumb motion, finger motion, and a bit of the wrist as well. Depends who you are. Like Howard Alden has this kind of screwdriver technique, but if you watch George Benson, he rests his fingers against the scratch plate, the pick guard, and then uses a lot of finger motion. And that's actually what I recommend, because the pick guard is there, and it's usually a floating kind, so it actually doesn't matter that you touch this. And George manages to have very, very, very beautiful, a very beautiful tone and lots of articulation. The danger with this technique is if you're not like George Benson, sometimes you're not so articulate, and this sounds like you're not sloppy. It sounds sloppy. Because even though you're in sync, the attack is so weak that it sounds sloppy. As opposed to so I would suggest that whatever technique you adopt, you try to learn to be articulate. So if you play with the pure form, you don't necessarily have to anchor your fingers, but if you're playing on an archtop with a scratch plate, then that's another reason it's there for. It's not going to affect the tone whether you touch it or not. You might as well do it. Okay, I'm not a pro at this, but let me show you from this angle what it could look like if you use some sort of hybrid technique. Not exactly like George Benson, but inspired by him. So you see, I'm using a lot of alternate picking, but I am still floating. And I'm using this kind of motion, and I'm resting my fingers against the scratch plate. Another player actually that used the old technique was Wes Montgomery. He played with his thumb, but he positioned his hand in such a way that it looked like you were doing the old technique. So it's mainly downstrokes. It follows the same principles. So those are players that still maintain some sort of floating technique. And then there are other players who completely change their technique. They decide to rest their palm against the bridge. And notice the difference. The old technique, your wrist is kind of like this. With the hybrid, it's a little bit more straight. And then with the modern technique, actually the wrist is now like this. It's a completely different technique, a little bit unnatural, but you can still do, if you train it, you can do very, very intricate stuff. So players, early guitar players that have adopted this technique, well, lots of bluegrass flat pickers, but in the jazz world, you have players such as Grant Green, Barney Kessel. Actually, it's very funny when you watch Barney Kessel. Sometimes he will have some sort of a floating technique for certain things, slow melodies or chords. But when he's playing single lines, especially intricate lines, he switches to this. Probably one of the most famous to play like this is Pat Martino. And it's very funny because when he was a kid learning to play the guitar, he went to this famous teacher, Dennis Sandoli in Philadelphia, who insisted that he play with the floating technique. And Pat struggled so much with this floating technique. He just couldn't get it. And thankfully, he ignored his teacher's advice and just did his own thing. So it just reinforces what I said. Like, you have to figure out what works for you, what sounds good to you, and no one else can say that for you. Even when you play gypsy jazz, there are some players who have a hybrid technique and some players who even play like this. And as long as it sounds good to you, then just go with it. Each technique has its advantages and disadvantages, as we've seen already. The last chapter is right here.